Okay, please join with me in welcoming Glenn to the stage.
Tap on the glass, about a minute to go. All right. Very good. Good morning, everybody. I've been up since about 4:30 this morning. I had a meeting at 5 a.m. about a Streptococcus A vaccine that we're trying to develop to ideally rid rheumatic heart disease in Aboriginal communities. So I've had several cups of coffee. I'm just giving you a warning, that's all. So good morning. My name's Glenn Pearson, and I'd like to thank you, Bruce, for the invitation to come along and connect with you today, and to be part of the story that you're making here about better understanding the world that we all live in and making better connections, which is fundamentally the core of my work at the Telethon Kids Institute. I'm the Deputy Director of Aboriginal Health at the Telethon Kids Institute. We have 4 major areas of research, of which Aboriginal health is one. And we made a deliberate decision several years ago to fully integrate Aboriginal health as a core function of the Institute. My experience of working in the state and Australian government, has 15 years of that, I've been in the Institute for about 16 years, has been that Aboriginal health, like a lot of things Aboriginal, tends to be structured as a conversation or a story that sits outside of the core of the mainstream. It sits on the edge of town. So everyone does what they do in the middle, and then they usually try and do something for Aboriginal people on the edge. The ambition here is an acknowledgement that these kids, while they're Aboriginal, are also Australian kids, and that we need to bring those needs into the middle of what we do. So I think there's some interesting parallels in terms of the work here that you've been doing, and definitely the ambition that I have at the Telethon Kids in the work that I do as the Deputy Director. In starting, I needed to, as a Noongar, I'm a Noongar, so I'm not from, this is Whadjuk country. My family are traditionally, on my mother's side is from the Minang, which is Albany, and the Wadjuri, which is the Esperance Ravensthorpe area, and on my mother's father's side is Ewart country, which is on the Victoria Plains. My father's a Wadjula, so he's English, and his mother's Jewish, so I've got it pretty covered. And there's a lot of history, Jewish history of mine in Vic Park, so in some regards I'm coming back to another part of the Budja. But this is the Budja, this is the home, this is the country of the Whadjuk people. I want to thank them very deeply for allowing us to be on their country. They were never asked that they'd want us here, but they have been very generous in having us here. And to ask that we not only respect their stories and their songs and their ambitions, but they also ask for us, the elders ask for us to do good business with each other, for our families and for our communities. So I want to acknowledge them in the work that we do and in starting today. The heading of my presentation was Aboriginal Health, Disability and the Strategic Plan. That was the one that Bree gave me, so I just went with it. So what I've done is try to present it in a way that isn't so much talking to your technical competence, in the work that you do. I think there's an assumed, we can assume that we both have a shared ambition to want to be able to use whatever skills and our abilities to bring us together, to make a better place, a better quality of life for all people, regardless of the challenges or not. And the ambitions that all of us have and the skills that we bring, that's quite central to here. So I didn't want to necessarily talk to that. I wanted to, if I may, with your permission, talk to you in the way that I talk to the researchers at the Telethon Kids Institute. They are exceptionally bright, shiny buttons. There's about 750 of them there. We're completely focused on child health research and the full spectrum of research that we do at the Institute, from the basic sciences around childhood cancers to cystic fibrosis to vaccine trials and development of vaccines, through to big population data, linkage projects, through to working on community on really big challenges that are happening for our families. So we cover the full spectrum of research. We cover the full state, 2.5 million square kilometres. That's a fairly decent backyard. I often say when I mow east, I'm glad that we don't have to mow it. And we do work both nationally and increasingly internationally. So this little tiny hub that's got itself located at the new Perth Children's Hospital, which is an amazing facility. I've, like I said, been there since about 2004, 2005. So I've got a number of slides. The idea is that I'd want to talk to these researchers, not so much the science, their technical capacities, because I've sort of got those and they're developing, but really about them as researchers, them as human beings. And that really is the sort of central theme of my story today, to connect with you as other humans, me as to connecting to you. So I'll move very quickly, if I may. So out the front of the Telethon Kids entrance, at the northern entrance, we have a monument that commemorates that we're on Noongar Whadjuk Wudja. And when I went to the elders to talk to them, particularly Uncle Richard Wally, he said it's one thing to acknowledge that we're actually on country, but we should put a challenge to it. It's not just the acknowledgement of those obvious things. And so the challenge that we came up with was around, in Noongar, translated into English, was upon this traditional and sacred land we gather to work together for our children and their future. That's pretty good business, I reckon. Yeah. So what I've done is I've got a couple of headings and then a bit of content, but these are sort of the type of headings that I'd use with my researchers to get them to start thinking about them in terms of developing themselves as a human being, as a researcher. And at the fundamental of it, it's about being responsible with your science. I think research, like a lot of areas of investigation, exploration, has a great propensity to get interested about itself, to go and look into that particular phenomena, to better understand it, to come back to think about it and then make some statements and recommendations about going forward. And the Institute, we're 30 years old this year, which is fantastic. We were started by Fiona Stanley. There was a group of about half a dozen people. Like I said, now there's about 750 of us. So she's been really successful in her model, but the world that we live in, from the one that we first started, is a lot more accountable to the community in regards to the work that we do in terms of the clear and unmitigated need to have the community in our work, for them to help us design, to set the direction around that. It's their kids, it's their families, it's their communities, it's their money. I think even at a good manners level, we ought to start there, you know what I mean? A lot of those are key features in doing business in the Aboriginal community. You can't progress a conversation or do anything meaningful unless you have those central sort of aspects, elements in your work, in your approach. And it's all underpinned by this next one, which is joining the dots, staying connected, and about relationships. Aboriginal culture is a very strongly relationship-based culture. It doesn't really care about what you do, it really wants to know who you are. Yeah, and it operates very much at that level. It's about mutual respect, mutual understanding, about connecting, a relationship that's predicated one on trust. Because you can imagine with the history that we've had, that we didn't have a hand in, but we've inherited, and the fact that today's the National Sorry Day anniversary that Kevin Rudd set. And then yesterday, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, then announced, which I'll touch on, 12 years after setting the Closing the Gap challenge, how we've progressed. This sort of talks to the relationship that we may, like I said, have had a hand in designing, but we've definitely inherited, and it's the challenge that we have in going forward together as a people. But joining the dots, there's about 240 remote communities in WA. With those, there's all the different language groups that go with that. With that goes all the different stories and the histories of who they are. And rather than seeing that as something that's awkward because it doesn't fit into a neat box, I think once we look at it from a diversity perspective, it's an incredibly rich, beautiful way to be able to connect in the world in a way that we sometimes don't, and lose some of the magnificence of who we are. So joining the dots is really important. Staying connected, relationships are really important. Some of our relationships tend to be we come in, do a transaction of business, and then we nick off. Research is a classic like that. Yeah, we come in, do all the research, the bright lights of the research, collect the data, go do the analysis, come back, do a PowerPoint presentation, and then all they see is the lights of the cars moving back out. We have to change the relationship. We have to change the relationship. We can't do that anymore. And we can't look at research that comes in and works its way through all the different circumstances, what's happening in a person's life or a family's life or a community's life, only to focus on lungs and skin and ears when we don't deal with the issues of intergenerational trauma or do the issues of poverty. This calls for a way deeper commitment from us as an organisation, as researchers individually and collectively, about how we represent, advocate and work with Aboriginal families. So, joining the dots, staying connected in relationships is really important. Meaning making. Whose meaning are you making? One of the big challenges for researchers is that they'll come from a particular perspective, usually a scientific one, that's dressed up like it's the colour of water, but from an Aboriginal perspective, I know it's a very white perspective. They'll come in with mainstream views and reference points, and so the science will dress it up as being objective. But my experience is knowing that it is a very subjective. Science is science, but who gets to tell the story, how they tell the story, and where they tell that story is part of this that I challenge our researchers to start thinking about. Well, whose meaning are you making? And if you don't have a relationship with the other, like a real relationship, how will you know? So I think that's really important. A challenge that I put to our research to develop those sort of relationships and know more about it, because a lot of people who work in the area of Aboriginal health have little or no relationship to Aboriginal people. But a lot of us have very developed opinions and views around what we ought to do to sort out the Aboriginal problem. And scientists aren't immune to those sort of phenomena. Anyway, one of the stories that science is really good at is repeating again the story of Aboriginal health and wellbeing, and it's usually one that's presented into the domain as broken and busted. I've got a number of slides that were released yesterday in regards to the Closing the Gap. I'm just going to move through those and just touch on them lightly, and for you to imagine what that must be like to be an Aboriginal person to hear that. And to remember that this is the 12th time that the Prime Minister's come out this time of the year in opening Parliament and made these statements around these particular targets, which are seemingly fairly pragmatic and fairly practical, but clearly they're frustrating us all. So in terms of childhood mortality, the target was to halve the gap in mortality rates for Indigenous children under 5 within a decade, and that was by 2018. We're 2020, it's not met. I won't go through necessarily the detail of that, but what's happened is while there has been some closing the gap, the mortality rates of the mainstream has increased significantly, and the incremental growth in child mortality rate or reduction has been so slow that it's looking like it's standing still. In terms of early childhood education, the target was 95% of all Indigenous 4-year-olds enrolled in early childhood education. By 2025, it's on track. So there are some movements. The attendance rates are pretty hard and tough outside of the major regional centres. They're doing a lot of work in the inner cities. That seems to be getting some traction. Early education, as we know, education full stop is really critical. Early education is really important for a lot of our families because a lot of these kids come from environments where they need that sort of early engagement into the system to be able to get better assessment and supports for them to develop language and learning, lifelong learning, which starts very early in our child's life, because we know that those first 8 years of a child's life are very critical. And so if early education isn't plugged in and engaging our families early, our kids are going to struggle. I'm a primary school teacher. I know that if a child is assessed at year 1 as having a language delay, that child won't catch up to their peer where they need to be for another 2 years, and that 2-year lag will increase. And that's assuming that all things stay constant. But if that child lives in a circumstance that's pretty tough, there's a likelihood that will delay again. Excuse me, I might grab that glass of water. The next one is around school attendance. So the target's close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous school attendance within 5 years by 2018. It's just not been met. So even though we've now got compulsory education to year 12, and there's a whole range of systems around marshalling kids to stay in school and a whole range of efforts, we're still just not connecting at the fundamentals. We're still not getting kids to be able to stay in the course long enough. We know that there's a big gap between year 6 and moving into high school, and we know that by year 9, a lot of our kids have already made the decision that they want out. So that's not very old, that's 14 years of age. And if we know that education is, lifelong learning is the thing that really can enable our kids to come out of poverty and get those opportunities, and they're not there, then our kids are going to struggle. In terms of literacy and numeracy, halve the gap in Indigenous children in reading, writing and numeracy within a decade by 2018. Again, not met, but with improvements. So we're talking about a set of indicators that have been 12 years of concentrated Australian jurisdictional, state and territory and local community engagement. I'll move to the next one. In terms of year 12 attainment, half the gap for Indigenous Australians aged between 2024 in year 12 attainment or equivalent attainment rates. That's a lot. It's on track. So we've got kids staying in course, trying to keep them longer in the education system. Obviously, the new state legislation around kids going to year 12 has enabled that. But we're still getting kids that are still struggling to qualify at the end of school. Employment. So the target was half of the gap in employment outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians within a decade to 2018. Not met, but stable. Well, it doesn't take a scientist to work out if you haven't got a good early education and not staying in primary school and not having good high school education, the likelihood of being able to get a job is going to be even less likely. And similarly, poverty is a huge, big driver of stress in the lives of Aboriginal families and their ability to be able to look after themselves, look after their kids and participate freely. So again, the onset of these failure of upstream interventions. In terms of life expectancy, when it's all said and done, all of these things, it's about a quality of life. So it's not just about living longer, it's about having a good quality of life. And we still have a gap for about 10 to 15 years. So close the life expectancy gap with it by a generation. So by 2031, it's just not on track. It's just not on track. When we look at it in terms of some real terms, what I've got a slide here is the Department for Child Protection has published these sort of figures around the number of kids, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, that are in state care in terms of the total of kids that have been made wards of the state. There's 9,379 kids in state care, and of those kids, 2,437 are Wodjila kids or non-Aboriginal kids, and 2,942 are Aboriginal kids. So they're about 57% of all kids in state care are Aboriginal kids. And in some regions, they are 100% of all the kids in state care who have been made wards of the state. When you think about these numbers, in terms of the families that these kids come from, then we start to get a sense of the magnitude and the scale of when we have the failure of generations of upstream government policy impacting on the lives of families, and in this case on the lives of kids. This is the scale of the issues that we're dealing with. And my background is I've worked in the Department for Child Protection for 10 years when I first started in the state public service, and I do know that inevitably wealthy kids create wealthy kids create welfare kids. And I do know personally, because my mum was part of the stolen generation, is that my native welfare files, when I look at them, take my history back to the church and to the state for about 173 years of almost the state's 200 years of being made a state. And while that sounds exceptional, it's not. I'm just one of a range of Aboriginal people where the state and the church have participated in the lives of our families in the way that they have. And the ramifications of those policies are still being felt, as indicated in this table here. But what if? But what if these measures were measures of resilience? What if they were measures of strength? If you take any loving, thriving, excited, passionate culture and you were to subject them to the policies that have been subjected to on Aboriginal people in both removal of kids from country, removal of kids from family, in terms of the 1905 Act, which has owned and controlled Aboriginal lives from the cradle to the grave, who they could marry, who they could live with, who they couldn't live with, where they could work, where they couldn't work. And up until 1954 in Perth, you had to be out of the centre of Perth. And if you weren't, you were arrested. These aren't things that have happened hundreds of thousands of years ago or 200 years ago. These are things that we are now living with as a consequence, and they're living right here. But if you were to subject any loving group of people to those sort of policies, would you expect any other outcomes but those? Well, you wouldn't. In actual fact, you'd expect them to be almost flatlined. So if we were to invert and reframe those measures as rather than measures of broken and bustedness, but of one of resilience and strength and capacity to want to stay in the game and be part of it, then that might help us start to think about taking a way stronger strength-based approach in terms of all the things that we do. That from where the mainstream sees us as broken and busted, there's incredible strength that holds us. In spite of all the things that are going on, our parents love their kids, they want good things for them, they'll do what they need to do with the capacity they've got to be able to get them into the game. They're proud of who they are, where they're from, they want to celebrate. If you look at the NAIDOC week and how it's just grown and grown and grown, and now it becomes part of who we are, these are all good signs. Even the fact that we've got the Prime Minister coming up and talking about the recognition of Aboriginal people in the Constitution, or not. And even today when you had Senator Hanson coming out and once again blaming Aboriginal people and taking the responsibility from white people participating here, I go, that's not bad. We need to have this conversation. These are the signs of a maturing country. This is about us reconciling with ourselves and coming together. They are really important. And it's very much the conversation I have with the researchers at the Institute. They aren't just scientists who objectively work into people's lives. When we invite ourselves into people's lives, we take on a responsibility. We have to action that responsibility, not in the terms of which we are comfortable with it, by going the distance. If it means we're going to be doing some of these projects and we think a 3 or 5 year project is going to resolve it, forget about it. I say to some of the scientists, some of these projects you're doing, you might be doing this for the next 20, 30 years. Do you want to do it? Because if you don't, that's okay. If you don't, that's okay. But if you do, that's what you're going to be up for. Because that's the work that we need to do. We can't just do the potpourri projects approach to health. We need to get right into the middle of it. So the other one is around, for our mob, we love the big story. So tell the story big, then small, then big again. We love that big story. We want to know the whole lot. A lot of people come in, researchers come in, they'll go, all right, I want to ask that question, that one, that one, that. They only say, no. You got to tell the whole story. Tell the big story. Because then what you watch our mob do is start to orientate themselves into what you think you want to ask them. And then they'll start by way of a yarn around trying to work out where you are, so then they can start providing you with the story that you're looking for. Again, all predicated on trust and respect, about knowing. And our mob are very much around intuitive, around working with who you are, about whether you got the right heart or you just want to get there and become a PhD superstar, or whether you want to get in there and do something good for the community. So that's a really important bit. This is one that I put to the researchers around developing research methodologies that are as sophisticated as the worlds and culture that our families live in. I touched on earlier about the diversity of Aboriginal culture. We haven't got the market cornered. The mainstream, Skippy the Bush Kangaroo's got you got a very diverse world. And to assume that you're all just the colour of water or the colour of white, I don't. My experience, I grew up in Cloverdale. I have my own experiences, and those families are just as funky as each other. You know, there's a brilliance, there's a magnificence out there, and science has a great way of trying to objectify and dumb down. I think there's a beautiful richness in the lives of our community, and most definitely the community that you represent here, that is just waiting to glow and be part of and make the contributions to our side about understanding us better, seeing diversity as a strength, not as something that has to be managed into a box, to made neat. There's nothing neat about it. Life's messy, and it's meant to be, because that's what makes it exciting. And so we need to have research methodologies that are as exciting, as sophisticated as those worlds. Because if we don't, then we're telling someone else's story. We're telling someone else's story. We're telling your story, how you see the world and not their world. And if you want to make recommendations to government around policy and those initiatives or whatever it is, then you're going to talk to a world that doesn't even exist in that world. And it's any wonder then we have 12 years of the Prime Minister getting up there and talking about how these closing the gap targets, these really practical, simple ones, just aren't working, because we haven't got the sophisticated approaches in our relationships of doing business that allows these things to work together in the way they need to. The consequence of generations of government policy is that Aboriginal people have a welfare relationship with the state, not just in terms of welfare and employment checks, but a welfare relationship. And that means to me that someone outside of your world, because they have the power and authority and position, make decisions about what's your interests. And then when it doesn't work, they expect you to clean it up. We need to change that relationship. We need to empower our mob to be in the middle of those decisions so they can take responsibility for what they do in the way that they need the support, like any of us. And research has a great capacity to do that as well. So I'm very much around challenging our researchers to don't get into this sort of welfare thing. You're going to do something to come and save us. You can't save yourselves. Don't try and come and save us. We'll work with you though, because our future's tied up with yours. Absolutely. And the non-negotiable need for Aboriginal voice. That's quite critical. I've got a small little YouTube. I won't play it, but it'll be part of it. It's by a gentleman who I love dearly and adore. His name's Ian Trust. He's in Kununurra. I've known Ian when I had hair and I had colour in it. He still looks the same. He's gorgeous. He heads the Wernan Foundation in Kununurra, and he's created this story called Swimming the River. It's a beautiful little vignette story of taking to his community the challenge that we have around, and it's a conversation that only the community can have with themselves. This isn't the space for government to come and tell us how it's going to be. These are the stories about a community making a decision around the world that they want to have, the world that they want to see. And if it's not the one they want, then what are the things they've got to do to change it? It's a beautiful little story. So if you get a chance to have a look at it, please have a look at it. He's an exceptional gentleman. He's on our Aboriginal Advisory Board at the Institute, but he does an amazing work. So that's my plug for that one, and it's a nice little one. If you want an exemplar of something that I really love, and it tells the story, it's captured, and it gets people. It brings people together. Martin Luther King talks about truth being armed or unarmed truth, and science can be the same. So armed truth tells a story, but it blows us apart. We become more strangers than ever. But unarmed truth is the truth, but it brings us together. It connects us around what are we going to do about this. So this is a really nice unarmed truth one. So I want to talk about the stuff we're doing at the Telethon Kids Institute. How long have I got left? 5, great. That's all I need. I'll move through this pretty quickly. Under our strategic plan, which got launched at the March of last year, February of last year, we announced a number of things. One is that Aboriginal health is going to be a priority health focus for the Institute for the next 5 years. The Institute has now signalled an ambition to want to be the global leader in Indigenous child health research in the world, which is pretty ambitious. I want that to be defined by what the community thinks is global leader, world famous, rather than a whole bunch of scientists. The other one was a recommitment to the closing the gap and signalling exactly what I've just said. We can no longer work our way through the entrails of the experience of Aboriginal families and avoid all the obvious things. We need to bolt ourselves in and go for the long haul on those right issues. And the fourth one was around the development of these grand challenges. These are projects that will, by definition, are going to define us as an organisation and our value to the broader community. So this one was on Aboriginal families. So there's the aim and the purpose is around, it's a world first scientific program that's going to focus completely and solely on families. It's going to look at families in terms of with young kids, and we want to look at developing up over a 5-year period, setting all the right relationships up first, working through the strengths of the community to develop up the right governance structures, to get the right voices around the table in the first, to seek their permission to do this work with a view of opening up a space around families. And by then enrolling families, we're looking at households, so anyone who lives in the house, and then ideally with kids that are under 5. But the broader objective in this is around getting the relationship right, getting the structures right, and then over the period of the next 4 years, 3 or 4 years, is to get us into position to then start a conversation around the research. Not research up the front, but the research up the back. We just did a letter of support for this big funding grant that's coming up, and the Institute, since 2015, has won something like $63 million in research that's either targeting Aboriginal families or has a benefit for Aboriginal families. That's $63 million in less than 4 years. What I'm not able to tell you today is to what degree does that money make the difference in the way that we need it to, using the 12 closing the gap indicators as a simple measure. And that's the challenge that this Aboriginal Health Grant Challenge is going to provide for us as an organisation, to really start to look at what is it that we're winning and what is it that we're doing and how is it changing a net effect for Aboriginal families. So the vision for that and challenges, the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are the same as other Australian kids. Pretty cool. This is our ultimate key performance indicator. How does our research positively change the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids living anywhere in the state from 1 week to the next? Research has a great capacity to allow itself to float. This is about deliberately creating a space of urgency by pushing hard into the space, saying, well, how is this going to change some effect? How will this create some positive net effect? We need to be mindful and act accordingly. In terms of the Grand Challenge, so I'll just quickly move through this. This was developed by one of the 3 co-investigators. So my job is to overall manage the project so we don't get in trouble. And with me in the seat, that's most likely. So I also am one of the co-directors of the project. There's another gentleman called Professor Alex Brown, who's Australia's most preeminent Aboriginal scientist. He's going to lead our science program in the development of this, and particularly how we ensure that this research and the systems internal now match the ones that we're going to develop externally at a community level. And Julie Coffin, who's our most senior researcher in the social and emotional wellbeing, who's located in the Kimberley and from the Pilbara, is going to lead our community engagement and co-design. So the 3 of us each have a piece of responsibility, and wrapped around any child is our family and our elders. So our elders are quite critical, and working through elders is going to be quite important in the way that we design this. And then working to our families to work to supporting our kids. So these are the 3. So wrapping them around them is the 3 areas of work: scientific leadership, family and culture, and government and community. So they're the 3 pieces that the 3 pillars that this will stand on. In terms of how we'll set it up, because I'm mindful that we're going to run out of time soon. What we anticipate already, because a lot of the science that we've done isn't going to be wasted. I like to look at the things that we've done to now as being a dress rehearsal of getting it right. You know what I mean? It wasn't about mean and nastiness that got us here. It wasn't about deliberate, those sort of ways that these conversations get right. In my heart, I know, because I've been there for 16 years, that people have been working furiously to bring about positive change for our kids and our families in our community have committed themselves to do the absolutely right thing. What this allows us now to do is to reposition ourselves in a conversation that brings us together in a way that holds us together in the first, and works through all of our skills to bring it together in a way that the family can make best benefit and sense of it. And these are some of the areas that we're going to deal with: intergenerational risk, social and emotional wellbeing, infection and immunity, health services reform, we really need to look at that, child development, education, and personalised and prevention. So they're the areas that we've got skills that we can bring into the game. But none of that is going to count until the community says, yeah, we need some of them. And that's the change in the relationship, which is freaking out all of the researchers, because some of these people have got 30 years in the game on some of these areas, and we're going to say, the community don't go, no, don't need that. Anyway, they will, because they're good people, but anyway. It's good. People get when people get scared, sometimes they get focused. So over the next 5 years, we're going to go through this particular process, and it is that we'll work over the next year. So work for a whole year to work with the community about developing a co-design, collaboration, communicate, connect, develop up the right structure and systems, and get it right. Then it's around taking the pulse. So what we'll do is then move into enrolling families into the project. And what we'll do at that point is then we will look at identifying, do a needs assessment of each of the families, and we'll start looking at developing a needs action plan so we can provide something practical right up front. Science and research has a great propensity to ask the participants to wait for 5, 10, 15, 20 years for the benefit of their research that they've involved in. We're saying we need to put something way up front. So we get the governance right, the connection, the relationship rights, put something that's significant back on the table first, so there's goodwill and intent, and then we move into the next stage, which is about doing a health assessment. So we end up with a health and wellbeing assessments for each and anyone who's living in those families, in those households, particularly the kids. So we end up with a baseline. And it's about then that being the central source of truth for all of us to make decisions around what are the things that we need to do next, that we want to do next. So that's really important. And all of that in the fourth stage is about creating what we call is the architecture for change. So out of those things will come either research projects that will look at particular issues, or it might be about health and educational services reform. How can we get better connection between these fantastic services that the government, the state government, whoever the local government's providing, schools and other services, and how do they make better sense? How are we better connected to these families so we can support them as they drive the agenda around wanting good things for their kids? So that's the ambition here. The thing that made it really exciting, because this all happened last year, this was my last year doing this stuff internal, because our contract with BHP had come to a conclusion, and they said they wanted a good idea, so we put this together, and we took that to them, and they said, we like that idea, so we're going to give you $20 million. So they're going to give us $4 million for the next 5 years, and we're going to roll this out in Newman, Headland, and in the Perth Metro. So we're starting the consultation process in the Pilbara this year, and we'll start in the Metro in 2021, and then we'll follow those stages over the next 5 years. This is when we're all in. So we're going to be very vulnerable and naked as a consequence, and I think that's totally okay. Because sometimes we allow some of the trappings of whatever it is that we do in life to actually get in the way of us as human beings. It's the most amazing place. I have the privilege of working at Telethon Kids Institute. These are amazing people. I've worked for 15 years in the state and Australian government, and I'm a Noongar. He's 55, will be 56 this April, with the experience that I've had. My life's journey is that everyone I've met wants really good things for kids, and particularly for Aboriginal kids. And there's not for want of lots of effort and attempts and shots at people trying to do the right thing to get it going. And there's been some net benefits. The fact that I'm standing here is testimony that some of those policies must have worked. The thing that's obvious for me is if we're in so furious agreement around wanting good outcomes for kids, then what's stopping us? What is stopping us? And that is what I think is the heart of the question of the grand challenge. What is stopping us? And if we can understand that, then what can we do to stop those things getting in the way of us creating great things for kids and for ourselves and for our communities? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Glenn. I think this is Glenn's talk this morning is really consistent with a lot of things that have happened over the last 2-3 days, particularly about challenging the perception. I like your idea of, here's the report, it's 12 years on. How about we flip it on its head and look at it from a different perspective? And you're hearing a lot of this during this conference as well. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much again for joining us as our keynote speaker. Thank you, Glenn.